really the greatest story ever told. What you just heard is an eyewitness account from the Gospel of Luke of the actual events of the birth of Jesus Christ. If you are a parent, privileged to be a parent, most likely you remember the birth of your firstborn. Maybe what you ate, what the weather was like. I remember putting Hannah, my oldest, into our car, driving from Royal Columbian Hospital home, terrified. Like driving this speed limit, white knuckle, because all of a sudden it dawned on me all the responsibility, and I can't exchange her. This is a part of my life now. What you just heard was the actual physical events of the birth of Jesus Christ. And what I want to do is I want to give you three ideas. The first is that I believe this is a true story. It's a true story. Second, it's a messy story. It's a really messy story. If you get into it, it's a lot messier than what we acknowledge often. And thirdly, it is a story of stories. It's true, it's messy, and it is the story of stories. Luke gives us, at the very beginning, he says, in those days, Caesar Augustus. In those days. That's how Luke starts this historical event, in those days. Notice that he doesn't say, once upon a time. He says, in those days. With our kind of Disney entertainment culture, we would expect a myth or a fable to start once upon a time. But Luke doesn't do that. What does he do? He says, in those days. He's situating this in human history. And he's giving us two figures. The first is Caesar Augustus. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was for taxation purposes. And so everybody would have to go to your ancestral home to register in order to be taxed. That's the first figure. The second figure is in verse 2, where it says, this was the first census that took place while Quirinius was the governor of Syria. Two people. You have Caesar Augustus and you have Quirinius. Now, if you were to go home and you were to Google the Lucan census, which is what this is, the Lucan census or Luke census, what you would get is YouTubers gone mad, okay? Because here's a problem that we first interact with about this historical situation. We know from Matthew's gospel that Herod was a part, he was in power at the time. We also know from Luke 2:2 that this happened when Quirinius was the governor of Syria. Here's the problem though, folks, is that we know that Herod died in 4 BC. We also know from Josephus, a first century historian, that Quirinius became the governor of Syria in 6 AD. Luke is saying this is happening at the same time, but Herod died in 4 BC and Quirinius came to power in 6 AD. So what is it? What do we do when we come to this type of maybe contradiction or something that's imprecise in the Bible? The first thing we do is don't freak out. It's okay. There's many, many different ways that we can sort this out. So if you allow me, I want to give you 3 ways that we can sort out maybe this kind of historical incongruence that Luke is giving us. Okay, the first way is that maybe Luke is just being imprecise. That's a possibility, right? So like if you're 60, 70, 80 years old and somebody was to ask you, when did you get your first job? You would say 14? Well, could it have been 12? Could it have been 16? Probably. You're getting it in the general vicinity. That could be what Luke is doing here, right? Maybe the 10-year gap between Herod and Quirinius, maybe just like it happened just in this time, in that area. Which maybe is true. We know that Luke, this eyewitness account in Luke chapter 3, says about the start of Jesus' ministry. He says Jesus began his ministry when he was about 30 years old. So maybe that's what he's doing. The other 2 ways that we can maybe work our way through this kind of Lucan census controversy, as it were, would be to look at the original language in which this was written, which is Koine Greek, and see some of maybe the translation difficulties into our English translation. The first has to do with the word governor itself. Okay? So maybe in the Greek, you can get governor from this word, or you can also get administrator. So maybe Quirinius was the administrator, not the governor, the administrator, and was present under Herod's reign before this happened. That's a possibility. The other possibility is that not so much with the role, but with the actual word, because it says in Luke 2:2, this was the first census that took place while Quirinius. But if we look at the original language in the Greek, what we know that this word could also be before. So maybe this happened before Quirinius was the governor of Syria. Now, For those of you, you may not care about this, but it actually matters because Luke is rooting this in history. So there's many different ways that we can make our way through this Lucan census controversy. But here's the point. It doesn't start off by saying, once upon a time. Luke gives us in those days. He is rooting this in human history. The point is this. There is no reputable scholar that will discount the physical existence of somebody named Jesus of Nazareth that walked the earth in the first century in Israel. No reputable scholar of any stripe, any intellectual commitment would discount the idea that Jesus of Nazareth was actually born and walked this earth. So the question is, what is not, if it happened, the question is, what do you make of it? What do you make of all of this? Because you're here as a Western person, removed by 2,000 years and thousands of miles, but you're still here thinking about, reflecting on the birth of Jesus Christ. Let's be honest, the guy plays a significant role in human history. You are all here. I didn't force you to come. You're here because of this person. Also, I think what this helps us is it kind of takes it out of this idea of like how you feel about Jesus. Like, it just actually happened. It doesn't really matter how you feel. This happened in human history. So for some of you, you may remember Expo 86. Expo 86, right? So I was 3 years old in Expo 86, and there's pictures of me in my stroller eating a cheeseburger from the McDonald's downtown Vancouver at Expo 86. In a sense, it doesn't really matter what you think about Expo 86. Why? It happened. And this is what Luke is giving to us in this few verses. One of the stories that gripped my young imagination was actually in a movie, and the movie was called Hook. And this was kind of the modern day interpretation of the Peter Pan story with Dustin Hoffman as Captain James Hook and the late Robin Williams as Peter Panning turned Peter Pan. Okay? So I remember as a kid, this is dating myself, I was born in 83, I turned 40 this year. I remember as a kid taking my VHS tape. Remember those things? And I actually couldn't remember what this was called. Putting it into the VCR. I guarantee you it's not underneath a tree. Don't get excited. You're not getting a VHS or VCR. I remember putting it in because I loved the story. And I knew exactly at the moment where I wanted to watch. And it was when the Lost Boys came in and to save Peter's kids. I still quote this movie to my kids today, and this reference may be lost on you, but I will still say things like this to my kids. Oh, there you are, Peter, right? Everybody knows this moment. But before that all happens, there's an amazing scene with Peter Panning. See, Peter Pan has grown up, he's a business person, and his kids have been abducted by Captain James Hook. And he's having a conversation with Granny Wendy. And Granny Wendy is trying to break him out of his amnesia about who he actually is. And they go back and forth, and he really has trouble trying to understand what she's saying. And in this crescendo moment, Granny Wendy looks at Peter Panning and says, Peter, the stories are true. True. And this, my friends, to your ears today, Luke is saying the story's true. It's a true story. It's rooted in human history. But it's not just true. It's actually really messy too. It doesn't just end there. In verse 4, it says, so Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth. Now, I just talked about the Lucan controversy. I want to point out something here that I think is missed often. Because it says here, before we get to the mess of it, it says this, so Joseph also went up. Now, I don't know if you have the map of first century Israel implanted in your brain, but Nazareth to Bethlehem directionally is south. So you would think Luke would say they didn't go up to, no, they'd say they went down directionally south from Nazareth to Bethlehem, but he doesn't. He says he went up. They went up to. Why? Because Luke knows, and even at the time, the way that you would reference it, Luke knows he's not talking directionally, he's talking elevation gain. And the hike from Nazareth to Bethlehem is an elevation gain. And so Luke walked the ground, knows the place, says they went up. Here's the point. Is Luke walked this earth. He knew the direction and the land, and this is why he put us together. Now, as an aside, if you were to look at all of the directional, geographical stuff in the Gospels, there's not one time that they get it wrong. This is a point. I think we can trust what Luke is saying to us here. Okay, it says this. It says they went to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. File that. Pledged to be married, expecting a child. One of the problems that modern people have with the Christian message, one of many, is we are ahistorical Western people. In other words, we are progressed and progressing people. So what use of history do we actually have? If you got the first generation iPhone for Christmas tomorrow morning, you would say, what in the world am I supposed to do with this? How much more true if we think about a birth that happened like 2,000 years ago? Some of you may say, great, it happened, has nothing to do with my life. I am so far removed of time and space that it actually doesn't matter. But here's the thing. The Christian faith actually uniquely intersects your life and this. Because it's actually not this kind of pristine, perfect image that we get in Hollywood or in our nativity scenes. This is real life, and I want to tell you 3 ways why this story is messy and it interacts with who you are in your world today. The first one is the fact that Mary and Joseph have to go 80 to 100 miles south to Bethlehem. This is his ancestral city. Imagine a couple traveling, she's 9 months pregnant. The 2-week journey. I mean, that is so incredibly difficult. But why is he going to Bethlehem? He's going because they are under the thumb of a foreign superpower. They are occupied. They do not own their land. And this foreign superpower of the world of the day is highly taxing these Jewish people. People think up to 40% taxation. Joseph is going to Bethlehem with Mary to be taxed 40%. We know from Luke's gospel too that Mary is dirt poor. Nothing, she has absolutely nothing. These are nobodies from nowhere with nothing. In a very unique way, Christianity can say that Jesus was born into a family of absolute poverty. They had nothing. See, for some of us, we look at the presents under the tree and the food on our tables, and we're very, very grateful, and there's a lot of joy. But for some people on Christmas, it's a reminder of all that they do not have. It's a reminder that they don't have anything. And this Christmas, in the middle of your financial strain, in the middle of your financial reality, that Jesus, the Christian message can say, Jesus says, I know what it's like. I know what it's like. Financially, completely messy. Secondly, relationally complex. Why? Mary is expecting a child, and she is also pledged to be married. At that time, no. Why? Because the perception is that there is promiscuity outside of this bond of marriage. Now, what Luke gives us, we know, the reader knows, that Joseph had nothing to do with what was happening in Mary's womb. But to the outside world, it was highly, highly, highly controversial. That Mary and Joseph felt the dirty looks from their community. They knew the perceived shame that was a part of this. Without being able to explain or help people understand, they had to walk through this relational navigation of complexity, and they knew what it was like. If this is true, Christianity, Jesus was born into a world with these relational complexities. And let's be honest, it's Christmas, which is amazing. There's family, but man, does it bring up some stuff. That stuff may be even in the same row that you're sitting in. Don't look at them. We feel it. And this is a complex relational world that Jesus was born into. Finally, this is a messy story. Why? Because we know that the birth of Jesus was a threat to Herod's power. And Herod ordered an infanticide. Did you hear that? An infanticide, that all boys under a certain age should be murdered so that they wouldn't raise up and threaten his power. We know from Matthew's gospel that when Jesus was a toddler, with Mary and Joseph, they became immigrants in a foreign country. Why? Escaping Herod's murderous plan. My friends, Jesus was not born into a wintry wonderland with sweetly singing angels and little drummer boys. He was born into a war zone littered with bodies, corruption, and hostility. Do you understand? With bodies, corruption, and hostility. And Christianity says God knows what it's like. This isn't a message that just has nothing to do with you. In fact, Jesus can meet you in your current mess. That's what we believe. And he knows what it is like. All of this led Dorothy Sayers, a 20th century novelist, to say this. He himself, Jesus, has gone through the whole of human experience, from the trivial irritations of family life and the cramping restrictions of a hard day's work and lack of money, to the worst horrors of pain and humiliation, defeat, despair, and death. Guys, this is a messy story that Jesus was born into. And my sense is you're all carrying something into this room. And the hope is that Jesus can meet you in it. So don't you see? The Christian message is ridiculously and radically realistic. Because maybe your story as you come in is one of cancer diagnosis and treatment, a relational breakdown. Maybe it's one of financial trouble. Maybe you've lost somebody close to you and this is the first Christmas without them and you feel the loneliness of this time. Whatever you bring in, God in Christ can say to you, I know what it is like. For some of you, you may be facing death itself. God in Christ can say, I know what that is. I've been through it before. So don't you see, it's radically realistic and it is relentlessly hopeful. Why? Because God's response to the mess of this earth, to the mess of our lives, is not an abandonment. No, what is it? He's born into it. He writes himself into his own story. Realistic and hopeful meeting in the Christmas message. And I believe this is a message that some of you need to hear more than anything else this Christmas. Luke says, the story, it's a true story. It's a messy story. And he says this is a story of all stories. And here's how it ends in verse 6 and 7. It says, while they were there, the time came for the baby to be born. Now, I like what Luke does here. The time came for the baby to be born. If you're a woman in this crowd, you know there's a lot more going on than just that. The contractions are starting to be more intense and they're closer together. Joseph's running around freaking out. What am I supposed to do? Do you want water? He's trying to sort this out. But the time came for the baby to be born. It says, and she gave birth to her firstborn son. And Luke gives us 3 details about this birth. It says this, she wrapped him in cloths. That's the first detail. She wrapped him in cloths. And so, I mean, think of this. If your parents, you know the birthing process. Like Jesus going through the birth canal and comes out an afterbirth and the first cry. And as new parents are trying to sort out, is this normal? Is this supposed to happen? And then Mary's mothering intuitions kick in. And she realizes as Jesus comes to earth, 6, 7, 8 pounds worth of humanity, she realizes that if she doesn't wrap him up, the cold night's air could kill him. So she grabs what she can and she places it and wraps it around, listen, God. Think about this. Christianity is the only religion that would say God became so vulnerable, so fragile, that the night air, the day he was born, could have killed him. What humility. As she wraps him up. The second detail given to us from Luke is that she placed him in a manger. She placed him in a manger. So our nativity sets, I'm sorry to ruin this, but our nativity sets is like there's a wood structure, there's this kind of beautiful wood thing, you know. But as she's looking around, there is no bassinet from IKEA. There's nothing there. We know from the topography of Bethlehem, even modern day Bethlehem, there is no like stables. So freaking out, Joseph's like, I don't know, let's go over here. And Jesus was most likely born in a cave. And in this cave, animals would seek shelter from the elements. And so as she's wrapping God in swaddling cloths, she lies him, listen to me, not in an IKEA bassinet, but in a feeding trough for goats. That God does not come on a throne with parades. He comes all 6, 7, 8 pounds, vulnerable, wrapped in cloths, lying in where? A trough. Trough. The last detail that Luke gives is that they went to this place because there was no room. There was no room. Now, we don't really know whether this was actual, kind of like the classic Christmas story, the innkeeper comes, sorry, there's no room for you here, and closes. That could have been what happened. But also what could have happened is that being Joseph's ancestral city, that he had family there, and they just overbooked. So they're coming in, there's nowhere to go. And so where do they go? They go to this cave. And this is a place where Jesus is born. Jesus does not come to Los Angeles. He doesn't go to Paris. He doesn't go to Manhattan. Where does he go? He goes to this little small village, 3,000 people maybe at the time, in a cave, in a trough, in cloth. And this is the story of stories. If it's true, you got to say, this is that God, who is all of these things, almighty creator, becomes fragile in a trough. You got to say, this is a remarkable turn of events. And so Christian thinkers for centuries have been trying to nail down, what does this mean? And so they came up with this word, and the word is incarnation. The kind of center of that word is carn or carna, and this is where we get carnal. This is fleshly. And so Christians say that this is the incarnation of Jesus Christ, that God became flesh, that God has walked among us. That's what we say. So as I said, thinkers throughout the centuries have been trying to, make sense of this amazing story, the story of all stories. One of them is a guy named Søren Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard is a Danish philosopher in the 19th century, and like a good philosopher, Kierkegaard is trying to figure out how people come to know the truth. So he's testing some of these ideas, and he goes to something called the Socratic method, and maybe this is how people come to know the truth through the Socratic method. And he says, no. He has a faith conviction himself. So then he goes and he turns his attention to the Christian story. How do people come to know the truth? How would God come into your world to explain the truth to you? And Kierkegaard, in his work, Philosophical Fragments in 1844, uses this story. He asks the question, how does a powerful king fall in love and marry a humble maiden? How would he do that? Kierkegaard posits 3 ways that he could do that. The first way is that this king brings the maiden to his palace. But Kierkegaard says that won't work, because what will end up happening is that she will love the riches and not him. It's not going to work. The second proposal from Kierkegaard is that maybe with the king's power, he forces her to marry him. It's well within his power, well within his right as a king. But Kierkegaard says that actually won't work either. Why? Because that's not love. It's coercion. Kierkegaard says, well, there's a third way. And the third way would be for this powerful king to give up his right as the king and become a peasant himself, and become a part of her everyday life, to live next to her, to meet her in the market. And Kierkegaard says this and this only is the way that love could be reciprocated without elevation and without coercion. Don't you see? Only in this way does God reveal the true nature of love. And Kierkegaard says this story is the incarnation. He doesn't come forcing your love. No, he comes vulnerable in a trough in swaddling cloths. He doesn't come into your world to barge in and point the finger at you. No, he comes humbly. Kierkegaard offers us a beautiful image of the story of Christmas. And that this story, this pursuit, do you see, this pursuit of your heart and your life and your loves doesn't demand your respect, but demands your love. Here's the thing. This is a story of stories. But what it requires of you is 2 things. Number 1, an open mind. For some of us, we have closed the door way too quickly on all of the beautiful resources, story, and transformation that Christianity offers. Maybe open it. The second thing that it offers, or that it demands, is humility. Do you have the required humility to investigate a little more? Because you can miss it. Why? Because it's not happening on your Instagram feed. It's not happening as you pursue accomplishments or accumulation. That this is happening in a quiet place, and the thing is, you may have missed it or you may have forgotten. I realize that many, some, a few, I'm not sure, you may not believe that this is true, but I want to be clear, you want this to be true. You want this to be true, the story of stories. You want it to be true because if this is true, that God has done something in human history by writing himself into the story, it means simply this, that good does and will triumph over evil, that the walls of injustice will and can be broken, that the worst thing, the worst diagnosis that you could ever receive is not the last thing in your life, that the arc of history does indeed bend towards goodness and justice, that addictions can be broken, that death itself does not have the final say, that lonely people can find family, the marginalized can find dignity, that those with addictions can find lasting freedom, and the things that we despise about ourselves, the things that we are terrified that we cannot change, can actually be remade in Jesus' name. Because he goes from this trough to a cross to release you from the things that you can't release yourself from. And this is a story that has been transforming human lives for so long. Over 2 billion people have investigated the claims of Jesus of Nazareth and have personally interacted with it in ways that is transformative. I want to show you one of those stories. It's my friend Benoit. You can check this out.
So my dad has a saying, and he says, pride is a killer. I never understood what that meant. But looking back, what kept me from Jesus was pride. To the point where I actually had a motto, and it's, I don't bow my knees to anybody, even God himself. It took me into criminal activities, sex outside of marriage, drugs, partying, dropped out of school, things of that nature. So just a juvenile delinquent. There was one glimpse of light. It was my wife. My wife was a Christian at that point, and so we were married, and she every Christmas she would buy me a Bible, but she knew that I had this anger towards God. I said, you can take that, whatever. She was a blessing in disguise. When we were expecting our second child, 6 months within the pregnancy, we had bad news, and it was that there's a problem with the pregnancy. And the doctor said, listen, there's unfortunate complication. Your child has renal agenesis. Simply put, is the kidneys didn't develop. And the kidneys don't develop, then the organs are undeveloped, all the other ones. She said you have two options. You can carry out the pregnancy, the baby, your son's gonna be born, but because of the lack of lung capacity, your son will suffocate. The second option was that we could stop the baby's heart and the suffering. And so because my wife was uncontrollably sobbing at this point, and she looked at me, so I can't make this choice. I had to make the decision, and so I said, we'll stop the baby's heart. I don't want my son to suffer. I needed support and produce some kind financially for my family, so I got in the car every day and I tried to go to work. And so at that point, it's 45 minutes drive to this 2,000-man camp. And I couldn't get out of the car. And I did that for 3 weeks. Didn't go to work. I just end up at the security gate. And one day I couldn't take it anymore. I drove my car to the nearest church. I didn't go in. And I genuinely grieved and prayed to God for help. At that point, I wasn't sure about Christ. And there was one night my wife said, hey, we need diapers. And I said, okay. I drove to Walmart, and on my way back, I started talking to the Lord. And I don't know how this came to be, but there was a voice, an idea of climbing a mountain. And I said, that's a crazy idea, especially now. And but because of everything, the events that happened, I said, what do I have to lose in this point? And so I drove around until I felt a voice saying, this is the mountain I want you to climb. I kneeled down. The rebel made me kneel down. I get up and I start ascending the mountain. the whole time engaging with God and at the same time thinking how the lunacy that was about to happen and what am I doing? And it's dark out, there's flood warnings. I get to the top, I'm here, God. And so I turn around, the clouds part, a rainbow appears. There's a tree about 10 feet away, and on that tree, what looked like the shadow of Christ with his hand parted out. And at that point I said, God, I'm yours. I felt that relief. I felt like God had my back. I felt home, finally. I felt there was meaning in the world, purpose in the world, and a living hope. And it changed my whole life. At that point in time, in me being skeptical, you couldn't change my mind. What happened was a spiritual change in me. My wife actually said that, Ben, you've changed so much. You're so different than you were before. It's almost like a new me. Even the love that I have for her, or the kids, it's so different with Christ. It's not a selfish love, it's unconditional. Because of what happened on the cross. If you want to look at true love, you look at what happened on the cross. But it all started with his birth. Jesus was born, and then he had to go on the cross to shed blood for us and to save us from our own sins because we couldn't do it ourselves. So when I look to the future, I hope I can be a really great ambassador of Christ. Well, I'm not blessed because everything went right. Just look at my story. I'm blessed because of Christ and what he did on that cross. It's hope for humanity, and it's hope for all.
The best stories always have the most unexpected plot changes. Like waking up on Christmas Eve to find my Canucks first place in the NHL. I mean, who? Glory be. Miracles can happen. Some of the best stories always have the most unexpected plot changes that you never saw coming. And here's the reality, is that the birth of Jesus, like nobody saw it coming. The first followers did not expect something like this to happen. Like Benoit's life, like it was going in a certain direction and never saw it coming. And radically changed and transformed. Why? Because there's an encounter, like not with a story, but with a person, and the person, his name is Jesus. And so we just believe, and we see so often, like the human soul, the human person can be radically transformed, radically remade because of an interaction with this person named Jesus Christ. This is what we celebrate, and this is what we recognize on Christmas. And this is a story of all stories. But I get it. Like I know who I'm talking to. And there's so many maybe hesitations towards this story. This is just a thoughtless fairy tale that people believe because they can't handle the pains of life. People who say, well, it's, this is pre-industrial, pre-scientific world. Of course they would believe fairy tales like this. I just want to say, for those people who just like believe in like a secularist, naturalist, the only way that we can know the truth is through hard sciences, I would just say, like, there are so many things in your worldview, like the idea of human rights, that you will never be able to make sense through the scientific method. Like, all of us hold to things that we cannot prove scientifically. And that we just believe that God, if this is who he is, he can suspend these natural laws and work uniquely in human history. For some, though, it may not be like an intellectual thing. It's like you don't like Christians. Like Jesus, you're like, okay. But the church, hesitant. People like me, you don't like. And honestly, there's probably a lot of good reason for it, to be honest. The church's history is not beautiful in many ways. But what I would ask, and maybe what I would say gently, would be can you just pause maybe your experience for a second? Because what you're giving up because of an interaction with your neighbor who's a Christian and is a jerk, or whatever it is. Like, what you're giving up is the actual thing that you need the most. See, all of us are asking and answering 4 different questions. The first question, all of us, like even if you're agnostic, atheist in the room, like you're all answering and asking and answering 4 questions. The first one is, who am I? What does it mean to be a human being? What is the destiny and nature of this human experience? You're all asking and answering that question. The second question is, what is my relationship to the world I live in? How do I find who I am and contribute positively to the world? You're asking that question, maybe not cognitively, but you're answering it with your life. The third question we're all asking is, what's wrong? We all know, you all inhabit a world where there's things that are off and wrong. What's wrong with this? As we turn on the news and see wars, what's wrong? Why is it that riches don't make you happy? Why is it that we arrive at goals that we've been pursuing for years and years, even decades, to meet them and only feel even more unfulfilled? Why is it that we can't stop that one thing? Why do bad things happen to seemingly good people? Why can't I change? All of these questions you are struggling with. And Christianity's response and resources for that question is enormous, and it's comprehensive, and it makes sense. And the last question you're asking and answering is, what's the remedy? Is it just to be a good person? Well, what's your standard of good? Is it to walk old ladies across the street? Great, but why are you doing it? What is the remedy to all of this? And the Christian story at Christmas gives the best answer to those questions. It really does. So pause. Remember, open mind. Don't shut the door too quickly. Maybe this is something that can be reimagined in your life, something that you left a long time ago. Maybe it can be reimagined in a new way, in a more significant way, in a pure way than it was before. And humility, because it's easy to miss them. But we believe that there's hope because of what Jesus has done. So why don't you stand? Let's sing a few more songs.